This week we'll be working with fonts and all the different types of things you can do with fonts in CSS. As you can see on this web page right here, I have some text that definitely doesn't look like regular text that one would make with a web page without creating a graphic. This is all editable text. It's all part of the code. I've just created styles and modified styles so that I can display the text with different sizes, different kerning, leading, different font faces, and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and discuss a lot of attributes that are available with fonts. We'll talk about some of the pitfalls and some things that you might want to think twice about doing, and other things that are perfectly fine to do that might give you greater control with your web page. Basically, when you think about using fonts, much of web design is dealing with type. It's in paragraphs, it's in headlines, it's in lists, menus, forms. Pretty much, a really large portion of what you come across in a web page is all related to type. As a result, the properties of styling type are essential to making a difference between a site that looks just thrown together and one that looks professional. More than any other factor, type makes the clearest visual statement about the quality of your site's offerings. Graphics are basically icing on the cake, and they certainly can help to make a statement and to reinforce your message, but typography is where good design begins. It's the difference between a Word document made from, template, like a flyer set up in Word using Word's templates, and a well laid out flyer created by a designer in a page editing application. It's the difference between taking the time to choose a font face that supports and enhances your design as opposed to just using the default font face, which in pretty much all the browsers is Times. Fonts are basically different kinds of typefaces. Each font is a set of letters, numbers, and symbols, and each one has a unique visual appearance. All fonts belong to a large collection, which describe their general look. Examples of this are things like serif, sans serif, monospace. Font collections are in turn made up of families, such as Georgia or Helvetica. Those are different examples of font families. A font family can be broken down even further into font faces, which are variations on the basic font family. And an example of this would be Helvetica Condensed, Georgia Italic, and so on. So I want you to think about text as simply being a block of type. CSS has a multitude of properties relating to fonts and methods to set properties relating to text. Font properties relate to the size and the appearance of collections of types. Text properties relate to the font's treatment, setting its line height, letter spacing, underlining, and so on and so forth. So let's just jump right in and work with a file that has to deal with font families. Basically, we're going to be working on a web page, and I have the basic code structure created for us. If we look quickly in the browser, this is basically what the page looks like. So it has no styling has been placed on this page whatsoever. It just basically is a header, a headline, and then many paragraphs that describe things about fonts. So we're going to talk about a lot of these things, and then it's here for you to read and reinforce as we go on. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like without any sort of styling whatsoever. Let's take a quick look at the code that we're going to be working with. So here we have our basic XHTML document. We have the style already added, although no styles have been defined, but this is just waiting us. And of course, we're going to be using styles in this document because this is the easiest way for us to work with one document. And then down here, we have the code. So you can see here's my H2 tag right here, and then I begin with my paragraph tags. I have also taken the time to add several classes around the different blocks of text. If we look in the browser, you can see that the classes, the divs, are not affecting the page at all, and we've talked about this in earlier lectures. But every paragraph that talks about a different font collection, for example, serif, this has its own div wrapped around it. Sans serif has its own div around it. Monospace, its own div. Cursive, and finally fantasy. And the reason that I put these here is because we're going to style these different sections to take on their appropriate font collection. So going back to our XHTML document, I did just want to point this out to you so you can see right here, here's my div with a class of sans serif around this paragraph. In addition, I have added a class of bold red, and I haven't created the actual style for that, but we'll be using that. Every name of the font collection, serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy, we're going to go ahead and style those as being bold and being red. So I just kind of set up this structure for us so that we don't have to go through and do that, because these are things that we've already covered in the course. What I want to go ahead and talk with you about next are the different types of font collections. Basically, if we look here, these are basically the simplest ways that we can specify fonts in CSS. We can use these 5 generic collection names: serif, sans serif, monospace, fantasy, and cursive. The generic collections represent the lowest level of support for font styling. You can get more specific by saying, for instance, for a serif font, you could say, I want to use Georgia, I want to use Times, and then I want to default to the user's default serif font. So this is our lowest level of font support, and we'll just start by looking at these as an example. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to define some styles so that my web page is a little bit easier to discern and to look at. I'll begin by just styling my H2 tag, and I'm going to go ahead and make a tag for H2. I'm going to go ahead and specify the font family, and we have done this in the past. And I'm going to go ahead and specify Verdana, comma, sans serif. I always end with the generic sans serif no matter what font I'm requesting, and the reason why is because if the user does not have this particular font, it will at least default to a generic sans serif, which will be closer to what I'm hoping to have my web page show as. The next thing that I want to define is font size, and we'll go ahead and specify the font size to be 200%. Then I'm going to go ahead and specify a color, and the color that I'm going to use is going to be 036, which should be a navy blue. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a border to the bottom of my head tag. So I'm going to use border bottom width, and I'm going to specify the bit width as being 1 pixel. I'm going to go ahead and specify the border bottom color, and I am going to go ahead and specify the color as being a gray shade. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify the border bottom style, and I'll go ahead and use a style of dashed. So if we save our page and we refresh in the browser, these are all the things that we put on the H2. Whoops. Let me just reload the page, and you can see that now this header takes on these particular properties. So it's blue, it has a dashed underline, which is gray. It's taken on this font family and this font size, and obviously it's changed the page quite a bit, especially the header. We're going to go ahead and we're going to, just to make the rest of this page a little bit easier to read, I'm going to specify some font styles in the body. And I'll just come down here and I'm going to actually style the body tag. So I'm going to open my style tags and get ready to do that. We'll go ahead and we'll just set the body color to something that is not so dark. So I'm just going to use a gray shade right there. I'm going to also go ahead and specify the font family of the body, and I'm going to once again just use my Verdana and sans serif choice. When designing pages for the web, it really is easier for the user to read sans serifs as opposed to serifs, and that's because they don't have those little like extra, like the serifs always have those little details at the end of the character strokes, and they sometimes can be a little difficult to read on screen with such a low resolution representation of your web page. So it's easier, especially with body copy anyways, not necessarily with headers, but especially with body copy, to go ahead and specify that the font, or you use a sans serif font. And I'm just going to do that because it'll be easier for you to be able to see what I'm doing as I lecture here. So the other things that I'm putting in here right now are I'm also specifying the padding right and the padding left on the body, so that everything is going to be indented a little bit from the right and left sides of my page. So let's take a quick look at what we've just done. If I come back to my page and I refresh, you can now see that all of my text is now in the sans serif font. It's now changed to a gray color, and it's indented a little bit from the edge, everything, including my header tag, my paragraphs, whatever I have in here. And that just makes it a little bit easier for us to look at and for us to read. So now let's go about styling some of, let's actually style our titles of our font collections, and we'll go ahead and we'll use a bold and red to make them stand out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define a class, a custom class, and I already created my class, and if you look down here in my code you can see that I'm using a class name of bold red. So I've put that around the word serif. I've used the class name around sans serif. So let's just go ahead and create a style for bold red. Remember, when you are styling classes, you always start them with a period. So bold red, like so, and I'll open and close my curly brace, and then I'll go ahead and put in the appropriate property and value pairs that I want to go ahead and represent here. So I'm going to go ahead and tell the font weight to be bold, and I'll go ahead and specify the color as being the red shade that I want to use, and the red shade that I want to use is 930. So if I save my XHTML and I reload my page over here, let me get away from these, refresh the page, you can now see that all of the areas where I defined that bold red class have now turned bold and red. So everything's working out the way we want. Now let's go ahead and let's start to put in the actual font collections around the specific areas that we want to designate as being a different font. So we'll go ahead and we'll start with our serif. I'm going to come back here into my code, and because I defined these with divs and also using a class, once again I'm going to start with my period. I'm going to open and close my curly brace, and then I'll go ahead and I'll specify the font family. And the font family, I'm just going to keep it really simple and just type serif. So it's just going to default to whatever the default serif font on my system happens to be. It will more than likely be Times for most of us. I'm also going to make the font color black just so that it stands out a little bit more so we can really see what's going on. So I'm going to come here and reload my page, and you can now see that this paragraph has changed to black, and it's also using the default serif font. So you can see how the font has changed, and it's much different than the sans serif font. It does look quite a bit smaller. It is actually the same size. I never specified size for any of the fonts here aside from my H2. So all of my paragraphs are using the same size, but because of the way that the serif fonts are rendered, it does show as a different size. And you can see how it might be a little more difficult to read something so small when you're using serifs. It's much easier to read the sans serifs, aside from the fact that it is a little larger. Even if this was smaller, it would be a little easier to read. Let's go back in here and let's go ahead and define some of these other settings. So the next one is sans serif, and this is how I named my class, altogether capitalizing the second S in serif. And I'm going to go ahead, I'll just copy this little line of code since I'm going to be repeating this multiple times. I'm just going to change the font family to sans-serif, and that's the way you always write the default sans serif. So we'll save, we'll come back to our web page and we'll reload the page, and you can see that now it defaults to my default sans serif, which is actually not Verdana. It is actually, I believe it's using Arial. So you can see how it does look a little bit different. Size has changed, and then of course we've changed the color to black so that you can really discern this. So that's helping. Let's move on to monospace. Monospace fonts are things like Courier and Monotype, and they basically give equal spacing to every letter. They're typically used for code blocks in computer-related books or to simulate a typewriter type look. So let's go ahead and let's define that. I'll come back to my actual web page here, and once again I'm going to go ahead and define my class, which is monospace, and I believe I wrote it like this. And then I will come in here and just paste, and then I'm just going to change this to monospace like so, which should give me the default monospace. So let's take a quick look in our web page, reload, and you can see how now this has more of a typewriter type font. All right. Cursive and Fantasy are ones that definitely offer some interest to your web page, but in some situations they are going to, not be consistent. I mean, basically in every browser, they're not going to be completely consistent. So you definitely need to be careful when you're using cursive fonts. Cursive fonts basically look like cursive handwriting. Some examples might be Park Lane or Brush Script. Cursive is usually used for like wedding invitations. It doesn't really get much play on the web. And if you check it out in the various browsers, every browser is going to use a different cursive font. It's going to display something different. So it's not a very reliable thing for us to use. So let me go ahead and set up my style for cursive. I'm going to open and close my, I need to make sure that I spell this right with a V in there, or that wouldn't do me much good. So I'm going to go ahead and type cursive, and then I'm going to just paste in the code, and we'll change this to cursive. And then once again, I'm using the default. So we'll save, and I'm using Firefox on a Mac right now, and you can see it does give me a cursive type font, and it looks very different. If you are doing this and you are using a different browser and a different platform, you'll probably get different results than I have here, because as I said, Cursive and Fantasy fonts you're not going to get consistency, and I'll demonstrate that once we code our Fantasy. So let's go ahead and do that in there as well. I'm going to type dot fantasy, open close the curly braces, and then we'll go ahead and just paste in what we want to have happening here. So I'm just going to specify Fantasy, and we'll save this, and let's refresh in our browser, and you can see that the Fantasy font is now showing just some random font. It looks like it's maybe Papyrus or something like that. But Fantasy fonts are very hard to predict because they vary so much from browser to browser, and it's just basically all the fonts that don't fit in the other four categories. They're not serif, they're not sans serif, they're not monospace, and they're not cursive. So that leaves you a lot of variations that you can choose from. I'm going to go ahead and take this same web page, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up in a different browser. So let me just come back into Dreamweaver, and I'll just go ahead and preview this in Safari, and let me bring this page over here for us to look at really quickly. So here is the page in Safari. I'm going to make this a little bit more narrow, and we'll look at it side by side. It actually does tend to look fairly close to what I have in Firefox. Some of my line spacing, which I didn't set, is not completely right, but it does look like it's rendering the same. Well, actually not here. This font is different than what I have here. You can see that they're both using cursive fonts, but some of them are a little bit different. So it's really, really important to check if you're going to use, Cursive and Fantasy in pretty much all of the browsers and all the platforms to make sure you get some sort of consistency. In all honesty, I would really not recommend ever using Cursive and Fantasy because it is so hard to get some sort of consistency. with your web page. If you really want something to look like this, you need to ensure that whatever font you're choosing is installed on the majority of the user's browsers, and that it will render. So if you could pick a specific cursive font or a specific fantasy font, and then just have this be like the backup font, that may be an option for you. Or you would want to go ahead and create this particular text, whatever you wanted to display like this, to be a graphic, and then you would ensure that the users would always see it. So the most common fonts that you're going to be using are the ones that you're assured that everyone has installed on both platforms and all the browsers, and they're going to be Arial, Courier, Georgia, Times, Verdana. A little side note about Verdana and Georgia: those two particular fonts were actually created specifically for web use, so their readability on the web tends to be a little bit better than some of the other fonts. So you might want to think about using Georgia and Verdana often, because they were specifically made for on-screen use. I do have a link in my little document here that is going to take us to a website that basically lists all the common fonts for Mac and Windows equivalents. So this should just take a moment to load. So let's take a look at what we have down here. If we scroll down, you can see that it lists the font collections that are pre-installed on both systems. Here we have Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. It shows you an example of how it would look in normal style and how it would look in bold. So these are ones that would definitely be pretty safe. Everyone should have all of these fonts installed because they come pre-installed with your system. So if you wanted to use Impact, it should be a pretty safe choice to use, or Tahoma, or Palatino, or Lucidia. So if you were going to use something like this, I would certainly specify as your backup and having sans serif, and they display it here. Like, okay, if you want to use Tahoma, try Tahoma, then Geneva, then sans serif. So this would be a good resource for you to check out if you want to experiment with using different types of fonts. One other thing that I do want to point out to you is when you write a CSS declaration, you write it in the order of preference. So you list only the family name, and you always end with a generic name, such as serif or sans serif. And we've been talking about that. So here's an example down here. My font family that I want is Trebuchet. Then I will opt for Helvetica, then Arial, and then sans serif. If you use a font name that is more than one word, like Trebuchet MS, it needs to be in quotes. If you're using an inline style, like is shown down here, you're already using quotes to define the declaration, so you need to use single quotes around the font name, like specified here. So keep that in mind, okay? You will come across that if you're going to specify like Times New Roman. Obviously that's more than one word. If you were going to go ahead and use an inline style, you would need to put that within single quotes. Although if you were going to write Times New Roman up here in your embedded style or an external style sheet, you would just put it in the default double quotes. So hopefully that gives you lots of information on font collections and how to use font collections, and how to style your web page and have more control over how your web page looks. Style.